Alright, something that I've always found interesting about HSR is how some new characters can completely change how the game is played. And I don't just mean in terms of raw damage potential or supportive capability, but more so how the entire meta can shift around that one new unit, which can even bring back older characters who were sidelined in the previous metas, or some new ones that were never in the meta to begin with. Maybe it's best to start with an example here, so let's talk about the most recent one with the Herta. She offers a massive 80% crit damage buff to the entire team when she's run with an erudition teammate, and then she benefits further by gaining energy based on the number of enemies that are hit by her allies. Ignoring the fact that her kit specifically asks for an erudition character, it's no surprise that these kinds of AoE characters are the best for this, which really brings them back into relevance outside of stuff like pure fiction. What's crazy is that those two buffs shouldn't actually be that substantial in the grand scheme of things. Like, sure, the crit damage buff is nice, and sure, getting a free funnel of energy is really good for your DPS, but you wouldn't normally think that those two things would be enough to change the entire meta landscape. I mean, hell, Jing Liu gives herself 50 crit rate for free in her kit, which is technically more value than the crit damage Herta provides, yet we all know where she is on the tier list. It's the fact that these seemingly innocuous things resulted in a total meta shift that makes this really interesting to me. Like, on paper, they're not that crazy, but in practice, it's resulted in sweeping changes. Like, we're now seeing old characters that had mostly fallen off, like Argenti and Serval, coming back into meta prominence with new builds using stuff like the Passkey Light Cone and the Wind Relic set.
I thought you were dead.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
We've also now got characters that were previously pretty much locked to pure fiction, like Jade and Small Herta, being used outside of that mode. And it also unlocks some weird pairings, like running Jade and Linksha together with the Herta, because Linksha's frequent AoE attacks work really well to funnel energy to Herta if you buff her with Jade as opposed to Jade buffing Herta directly. All of these meta changes happened pretty quickly too. Like, all it took was the release of one character, and it was almost like the potential of erudition and AoE units was unlocked. Sure, you could say that Passkey Server was already usable for bosses like the Banana Monkey, but it felt niche then, whereas now it feels strong. You could also definitely argue that this resurgence is just because the newer content is being catered around Herta, but honestly, she actually does decently well against content that wasn't specifically designed for her, and the last MOC with Svarog is a great example of this. Even outside of that though, I don't really see a world where both her and erudition as a whole will ever lose relevance in pure fiction, so at least they've always got that for long-term sustainability. Honestly, with how overtuned her AoE damage is, as well as the recent changes to pure fiction where enemies continuously spawn, she'll realistically only get better as time goes on, especially with newer character releases specifically meant for that mode. Like, if Jade 2 releases down the line, they would probably work really well with Herta, which would then allow you to use regular Jade on the other half. It could even potentially open up opportunities to run all three together, assuming they would offer some kind of buff to the other units like Jade's speed or Herta's crit damage. On top of that, I feel that Herta wanting another DPS on the team will keep her relevant even when the content doesn't specifically favor her element, kinda like how Fei Zhao works with multiple follow-up units or how Acheron can use most of the Nihility ones. And that versatility is where I think all this game-changing potential comes from. The three characters I just listed are all Emanators, and all three of their kits reach their true potential when you run them with units from their respective paths. It's less about these characters being insanely strong on their own, and more about how they can enable an entire group of others to be good too. So I guess that's one of the privileges of being an Emanator. Being an Emanator and getting bonuses from specific things related to their path can even give niche use cases to different units, for example like how Waveman showcased a Clara buff by Fugue funneling stacks into Acheron for her ult. If we continue to get these Emanator tier characters every so often who can offer weird and niche use cases for different units, then that could function as a way for Hoyo to indirectly buff characters without the need for direct changes to their kits. There's actually a ton of potential there, and more importantly, it can also bring a lot of fun to the game too. Like, who would have ever thought that a destruction follow-up attacker like Clara could be used with someone that wants Nihility units? Sure, it's not the most viable thing in the world, but if it works and you get a clear doing something crazy like that, then that's awesome. With that said, despite the opportunities that Emanators bring for old units, it actually is a little bit concerning to me that these gameplay situations are pretty much only enabled by them. But it's not all doom and gloom here, because I actually do think there's a solution to this problem of potential unlocking only coming from Emanators, and it's also an opportunity for Hoyo to do something neat, which is simply just using their 4-stars. 4-stars have a lot of problems at the moment. For one, they barely get released. I mean, our last one was Moe's all the way back in 2.5. But also on top of that, their strength is generally too weak to actually have relevance in the game. These characters basically need to be equivalent to 5-stars in terms of strength like Gallagher or Hunt March to have a defined purpose, because normal 4-star kits kinda just suck in comparison. On top of that, their kits are generally designed to be side grades for characters rather than doing something unique, so you'll almost never use them if you own their 5-star counterpart. Personally, I think the easiest solution to this is if Hoyo used 4 stars as a way to unlock the potential of other units instead of just being replacements for the 5-star ones. Genshin actually does this relatively frequently by making their 4-star units enablers of specific playstyles or by having them be buffers of different elemental damage types. For example, for the Anemo element, Farazan is one of the best buffers. For defense scaling units, Goro is a great option. For the overload reaction, Chevreuse enables the characters that create that reaction to have more team options apart from the general hypercarry compositions that use broken characters like Bennett or Farina. Creating 4 stars like this not only gives them a real purpose other than being a replacement or a side grade, but it also gives Hoyo easy avenues to actually put 4 stars in the game despite them being technically weaker than what we'd get if they were a 5-star. Like, imagine if there was a character specifically built to buff ice characters, and no, I don't really count Pella's 12% ice res down on her E4 as enough to be considered that. So here's a hypothetical example to give you an idea of what I mean. Imagine if there was a 4-star unit that actually did something with freezes like the disassociation mechanic does in the simulated universe. This would open up scenarios where you could build a team around the freeze mechanic rather than around something like a path, kind of like how Emanators do. For example, your sustain could be Preservation March or Gepard, one of your supports could be Pella, the new potential unlocker does their stuff with disassociation, and then you have an extra unit as a flex slot. Scenarios like this could come in a variety of different flavors, whether it's for elements, paths, or even some new mechanic they might want to add. So basically what I'm saying is I feel that the game needs characters other than Emanators to be these enablers. You could definitely argue that the Trailblazer introducing both Super Break and True Damage is one version of this already happening, but something I think that's worth mentioning here is that we don't actually get Trailblazer paths or Emanator tier characters all that often. I mean, we went from Akron in 2.1 to Fei Zhao in 2.5 to the Herta in 3.0, and we only get Trailblazer variants once every major patch cycle. There's definitely some pretty big gaps there, so it does make me concerned that characters may fall out of relevance for a bit too long if they don't have a strong character to pair with. Personally, I feel these hypothetical 4-star characters could be a great alternative to introduce these meta shifts more frequently. On top of all that, Emanator releases historically come with a batch of HP inflation soon after. Assuming that continues, older characters that were made usable with one Emanator can quickly fall off again once the next Emanator releases and the HP increases to match whatever that new unit's strength level is. It could even mean an older Emanator is the one to fall off. Like, if we ever get a second Nihility Emanator, does that mean that Acheron will be the one being pushed out of the meta, or does that mean that we're going to get weird scenarios where you have multiple Emanators in the same team all providing each other massive buffs? Another thing worth mentioning about the Trailblazer paths is that you can actually use more than one of them at the same time. This means that when a new path releases, whatever they previously unlocked will no longer be relevant unless you get a replacement character to fill that niche. This is where I feel the future buffing system could come into play. If Hoyo doesn't want to introduce new 4-star characters all that often, then personally I feel that the buffs the older 4-star units receive should be from a similar line of thought to what I just discussed. Like, ideally they'll make these older units at least a little bit comparable to the pocket picks that Emanator tier units really want, or give them unique mechanics similar to what the Trailblazer offers. That way you wouldn't need a character like Zhao Cho for Acheron or the RMC for True Damage because the 4-star option may do something unique to be on a sort of similar strength level. For example, Serval is good for Herta teams now, but what happens when Anoxa releases who's probably going to be for her as well? If Serval isn't buffed to be at least somewhat competitive with him, she'll completely fall by the wayside just like how Pella did when Zhao Cho released. To combat this, Hoyo could do something like changing her A4 trace so it gives her a small amount of energy every time she takes a turn. This could encourage players to build her in a way where she gets more actions, which would then allow her to have a more impactful role in those teams, and that only makes her viability in that niche last even longer. Having other comparable options to the pocket picks makes them less of a must pull, which can only be considered a good thing, especially for free-to-play players or people that don't want to get those pocket pick units. All we can really do is hope that the buffs end up making older characters we already have at least somewhat competitive with newer options that will undoubtedly be released, just like Zhao Cho was for Acheron, and how a character like Anoxa again will probably be for the Herta. To wrap up my thoughts on all this, while it is cool that Emanator tier characters can bring older units back into relevance, it does feel kinda disappointing that we have to wait for a past Emanator to drop for that to happen, and also that a new character release can invalidate old ones. So, I feel that offering new ways for older characters to be used either through buffs or creating new ones with unique kit designs would be a great way for the game to go moving forward. How do you feel about all this? Are you okay with Emanators being the only real game changers, or would you like to see meta shifts that come from them happen more frequently? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, join my Discord link down below for a place to hang out and chat, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.